Okay, today's daf we're going to learn is Eruvin Memvav. Today's daf is sponsored by Renana Dine in honor of Rabbi Dan Ross. To a great chavruta, thank you for supporting my Torah learning and supporting the Torah learning of women everywhere. And to my grandmother, Sonia Washitz, on her 95th birthday, who has always been a role model to me, wishing her more years of continued good health. Before I start, I just want to mention one thing. This week, Hadron moved to a new server because we were having a few problems with the site being down. If you see it, as always, when there's a move, other things happen. Like, for example, the Safaria is no longer on the site for today, yesterday. So we're working on it. Hopefully it'll be fixed by sometime later today, but be patient. It'll work out over time. We'll get it back on. If you have other problems, like something happened on Monday in the study guide because the server move was Monday and somehow the study guide was no longer on the site. Someone wrote to me last night. If you see problems and things, please write to me, let me know so I can fix the problems because I'm not on every page of the site and I don't always realize where there's issues. So feel free to write to info@hadran.org.il and let us know if you have any issues and just be patient. Hopefully within the next few days, all the issues will be resolved and hopefully it will be a better move. Okay, with that, we're going to get started. We ended yesterday with this very interesting discussion about the rain and where the rain comes from and where the water comes from and how it works. And what we said was, B'Yom Tov, let's start with the first line that we started with, which was B'Yom Tov harehin kiraglei kol adam. If there's rainwater on Yom Tov, if it rains on Yom Tov, the rainwater gets to go. Now, I didn't exactly explain this, and I'll tell you today, there's two different interpretations. What does it mean, raglei kol adam? It means that one option is to say, if it's kiraglei kol adam, now think about all the people in the world can walk everywhere. It means that the water can be taken anywhere you want. There's no boundaries at all of Tchumen on this water. Other people say that no, what this means is, it means whoever picks up the water, it's like the classic hefker. When it's hefker, it doesn't have any, right, and that was the whole debate, doesn't have shvita. And when somebody picks it up, they give it whatever, right? And the difference between this and hefker is, hefker existed when Yantif started, or Shabbat started. So therefore, maybe you'd say there it's konesh shvita, but here it's not because it didn't even exist. It wasn't on earth, right? It wasn't in our possession yet. Now it comes down on Yom Tov. It gets limited by whoever picks it up. Okay, that's the second option. If you remember, I'll just remind you of this halacha that when it comes to food or objects, we say that those objects assume the tchum of whoever the person was. That's why we had this case in the Mishnah of three people who wanted to eat together, but they weren't all in the same tchum, right? Their tchumim didn't overlap, and the question is, who could share food with who? Because only if their food was allowed to go in that tchum could they, right? Only if their tchumin overlap could they eat their food together. Okay, so now someone asked a question, by the way, I'll throw it out. Maybe somebody knows the answer. I saw in one of the WhatsApp groups, they asked a question, which is, if those three people can't all eat together, right? Only two can eat with two, and two, right? Two can eat, but not the one and the three. So can they make a zimun together? Because they can't eat necessarily the same food and they're considered in different spaces, or their food is in different spaces. It's just food related, but they can obviously sit together and maybe they are considered the same for a zimun or not. I don't really know the answer, but it's a good question. So now let's move on to, we're in the middle of this discussion about if we assume that the water is not bound by tchumin, that must mean that maybe we don't hold like Rabbi Eliezer, that Rabbi Eliezer said all the water comes from the ocean, right? The water goes from the ocean, it evaporates, goes into the clouds, comes down from the clouds. If it came from the ocean, then you would say, oh, this was brought from outside the tchum, and then it should have no more than 4 amot, 4 cubits. So then they said, what? Oh, it must be, you saw the rain clouds, they were full of the water before Shabbat, and then it came down from the clouds. And then it would have to be, it was a very identifiable cloud, and you knew it was the same cloud that the rain came from. But let's assume all that is the case. Now the Gemara said, and they gave a separate answer, which wouldn't necessarily assume that, which is just, this is all d'Rabbanan, because the whole law of food being bound by space, by the tchum, is all d'Rabbanan. So maybe we just are lenient, and we'll get back to this concept of leniencies and d'Rabbanans later today. But now they say, wait a minute. So fine, let's assume it didn't come from the okeanos, from the ocean, but it came from the clouds, was in the clouds when Shabbat started, or Yantif started. But liknei shvita ba'avim, but then it should have acquired shvita in the clouds, and it came from the clouds to us. It moved more than 2,000 amma to get from the clouds to us. So that should be a problem. So maybe tif shomine, we can infer from here the fact that that's not an issue. Maybe you could tell us that we don't hold tchumin above 10 tvachim, right? That was our whole question with Eliyahu when people were flying, right? Do we hold tchumin or not? Because if there was an issue of tchumin lamala me'asara, then we would be kona shvita in the clouds. Okay. So now what do they say? No, that doesn't prove anything. You could still say there's tchumin lamala me'asara, but maya ba'avim mivla b'li'eh. The water is absorbed into the clouds. Okay, meaning, right, that this is all about the way it works, and it's not the same form, right? Well, we'll get to that in a minute. The water is absorbed in the clouds. It's not like it's actually water. So only when it comes down as rain does it kind of become water. Okay, it turns into water, and that's why it's okay. That's why it wasn't Kona Shvita up there, because it was just part of the clouds, really. It wasn't its own separate entity. But now the case, wait a minute, that creates a different problem. Kol shekain tahavaluhu nolad. Well, then how could you even use the rainwater? Forget about tchum. You can't use the rainwater at all. It's what we call nolad. It's like fruit that fell off a tree or an egg that hatched, right? We call that nolad. It wasn't in existence yesterday when Yantif started. Dasire, it should be forbidden. Ella, so they say, no, forget that. That's not the issue. We don't view it as if the water wasn't there and it was just created. No, even though it changes form, still it was created. Elamaya ba'avim menad naide. The water in the clouds is constantly moving. The clouds are moving, and therefore, right, that's how they viewed it. And therefore, what do we learn? Like in the boat, if the boat's constantly moving, you're never kona your 4 amot. If you don't kona your 4 amot, then you don't have bounds of, right? You're not bound by tchumin, because you never, if you establish your 4 amot, then you say, that's my space and that's what I have. If you never had a space, then when it gets down to earth, that's when it has a space. Gets down to the ground. So now they say, wait a minute. If you're giving that as your reason, then let's go back to the beginning about the ocean. We don't have to say that it was a specific cloud and it was already there and it wasn't in the ocean at this point, but we could say, the whole thing about the ocean shouldn't even be a question, because the water in the ocean is constantly moving. So you could say the same thing. The water never acquires shvita there, in which case, even if it started there, went to the clouds, came down, all happening on Yom Tov or Shabbat, shouldn't be a problem, because there was no shvita acquired beforehand, and it only acquires a resting place when it gets down to us. The Tanya, and there's a brighter that furthermore proves this, Naharot hamoshchin umayanot hanovin harehen keraglei kol adam. Okay, the waters are like the raglei kol adam, which again can be interpreted in both the ways that we said before, but basically means because they're moving, they never acquire shvita until someone takes them. And then maybe they never acquire shvita, and maybe they're constantly in flux, or maybe they're keraglei kol adam, whoever picks them up, and even though they eventually rest somewhere, maybe waters are not bound by any boundaries. And maybe they also, you could say that maybe they're keraglei kol adam, whoever picks them up. Okay, if you go with this idea that they're boundless and they never acquire any sort of tchum, why would water be different, right? This is an interesting thing. First of all, it came down on that day, and therefore maybe it's not bound, because it didn't have anywhere where it rested when it started. Someone actually suggested to me that maybe the idea of the water being a mashal for Torah, and the Torah is boundless, and maybe there's some nice idea there about it having no bounds, and it's like Torah that has no bounds. I don't think this is what the Gemara is saying, but I think that you can take this idea about comparing Torah to water. You could say this is some way where the water shows it has no bounds, and likewise you could say that the Torah is the same. Amar Rabbi Yaakov bar Idi, Amar Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi. Now we're going to get into Psikat Halacha. Who do we hold like? Remember our Mishnah, we have Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri against the rabbis. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri said, someone's sleeping when Shabbat comes in, right? We basically say you acquire Shvita even though you were sleeping. And we gave 2 reasons. One is if he were up, he would have had knowledge and he would have said, this is where I want my place to be. Or we say, Cheftze hefker konim Shvita, right? That since things that don't have any, right, inanimate objects can acquire Shvita wherever they are, then we would say the same thing for this person who is sleeping. He's no worse than an inanimate object when he's sleeping. So therefore, he says you have 2,000 amma. The rabbis disagree and they say, no way, you didn't acquire Shvita and all you have is 4 amma. This is a good reason not to fall asleep right before Shabbat starts, right? You get yourself into trouble. So again, this is only if you're not in your house, right? You're in some random place. You were walking, you were traveling, you were somewhere. If you're by your house, then obviously you acquire Shvita because you're in your house. Okay, so that's not an issue. So now we're going to say, now we're going to move on and we're going to say, who do we hold like? And then we're going to get into all sorts of issues about psikat halacha. How do we determine halacha in general? So Amar Rabbi Yaakov Idi Amar Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi halacha ki Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. We paskin like him. Okay, thus says Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. Remember this because we're going to get back to him. He's an Emorah from Israel. Amar lehu Rabbi Zera le Rabbi Yaakov bar Idi beferish shmialach or michlal shmialach. Did you hear him explicitly say this, or did you derive it from something else he said? So Amar le beferish shmiali. He said, I actually heard it from him directly. I heard him say it. So now they say my klala. Where could he have derived it from? If, right, he gave him two suggestions. The assumption was that he must have said something that could have been derived. So he says, Da'amar Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, halacha kedivrei hamekel be'eruv. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi said elsewhere that we go by the lenient opinion when it comes to eruv. So now, if we go by the lenient opinion, who's lenient here? Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, right? Because he says, if you sleep, you get more than 4 amot, you get 2,000. So now the Gemara says, V'tarte lamali. Well, if that's the case, now we're going to start this big question, which is, if that's the case, then you don't need Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi to have said halacha Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, because if he holds, we always hold like the lenient opinion, then you don't need to say halacha Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, and that's going to lead us to a big question. Before we get into, I just said we're going to get into in general how do we hold, but first we're going to get into this big question, which is going to lead us to how do we hold paskin in general, which is how do we deal with these two statements of Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. Why did he need to say both? And we're going to have 3 answers, but with the first one, we're going to get off on a tangent before we get back to the other 2 answers. So now we're going to say like this. Amar Rabbi Zera. Rabbi Zera is going to give the first answer. And this I charted all out, so you can see the chart. We're only going to get back to our Papa and Rav Ashi later. Rabbi Tzricha. Di'esh me'inan halachak Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, havamina ben lekula ben lechumra. Kamash manan halachak divrei hamekel be'eruv. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri's statement has a kula and a chumrah. Why? What we described about sleeping is clearly a kula, because instead of saying you're stuck and you only have 4 cubits, you can actually walk 2,000 amma. However, cheftze hefker konim shvita means that if I have unowned objects, ownerless stuff, and they're sitting in the street, they only have 2,000 amma from where they are, right? Maybe the city plus 2,000 amma if they're in the middle of the city. If they're in the middle of nowhere, they're 4 amma and then 2,000, and that's it. So if I pick up this ownerless property, I can't necessarily take it home with me because maybe that's not within my tchum, right? They have a different tchum than I do. That's a chumrah. If we say cheftze hefker einam konim shvita, they don't acquire, then that means anything I find that's ownerless, I pick up and it becomes mine. And then it takes on whatever my tchum Shabbat is. Obviously, we mean that I'm picking it up on Shabbat. If I picked it up before Shabbat, obviously it becomes mine and then it's like my property. But if I pick it up once Shabbat starts, or once Yantiv starts, then I'm stuck. So, right, I can only go as far as it can go and not as far as I can go. So that's a chumrah. So if he just said halachak Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, we would have thought bein lekula bein lechumrah. But then he says halachak divrei hamekel, which means we're going to take Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri for his kula, but not for his stringency. Okay, that's number 1. So then they say, well, then you could have just simply said v'lema halachak divrei hamekel be'eruv. Right, that would have been easy. Then we always go by the lenient. We go by Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri to be lenient, but not to be stringent. So halachak Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri lamali. So why did he need to say that? Itzdirich. No, you still need that. Why? Salkadat achamina. You might say we hold like the lenient opinion when, if it's, and here we get into piskei halacha and how it works. Yachid bimkom yachid. Often we have a machloket. Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda, for example, right? An individual versus an individual. Or Rabim bimkom Rabim, or a group of rabbis against a group of rabbis. And then we go by the more lenient. If all, this is like what we say, if all things are considered equal, then we'll go by the more lenient. However, if it's the case, right, we know that in general, we go by the acharei Rabim lahatot, we follow the majority. So, aval yachid bimkom Rabim emalo. You might have thought when it's an individual, neged, against the majority of the rabbis, then maybe we were not lenient. So when he says we go by the lenient opinion, maybe it's only if all things are equal. But if we have Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri on one side and the rabbis all arguing with him on the other side, maybe we should hold like the rabbis and not like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. So that's why he has to tell us halakha Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, because you wouldn't have learned it from we hold like the more lenient. Now, on this assumption, this is an assumption that when we say, and here we have a good example of there's always these principles that guide how we determine the halacha. But sometimes the principles conflict, okay? So we follow the majority. We have safek d'Rabbanan l'kula, that when it comes to rabbinic law, we're always more lenient if we don't know what to do. But sometimes those conflict, because if you go acharei rabim, then you might end up being more stringent and not more lenient. So how do we deal with these when they come together? So here the suggestion is that really when it's yachid mul rabim, even if the rabbim are more stringent, we're going to follow the more stringent opinion, even if it's a rabbinic law, because rabbim is more, right, that's more powerful. So Rav is going to actually question it. Amar la Rav Abaye, michte Eruvin d'Rabbanan. If Eruvin is d'Rabbanan, mali yachid b'mkom yachidu, mali yachid b'mkom rabim. Why should that make a difference? It shouldn't matter if it's one versus many. We still are always lenient in rabbinic law, aren't we? Thus says Rava. So Amar Rav Papa is now going to say, and we're going to have another opinion after Rav Papa, who are both going to prove that it's not true what Rava says. That really in D'Rabbanan, we're going to follow the majority, even if it's more stringent, okay? And in both cases, we're going to specifically talk about an exception where they follow the individual, but it's clear from the Gemara that it's only an exception and that it's not the rule. And from there, they derive what the rule is, and the rule is we follow the majority when he goes against an individual, even in D'Rabbanan, even if he's the majority or more stringent. So here we're going to see that. Amar le Rav Papa le Rava, u'b'D'Rabbanan lo shane lam ben yachid b'mkom yachid le'yachid b'mkom rabim. What, you think when it comes to rabbinic law, we don't distinguish between one versus one or many versus one? No, of course we distinguish. There's obviously a difference. V'hatznan, look at the following Mishnah. It should be Rabbi Eliezer. Every time it says Rabbi Elazar, it should be Rabbi Eliezer. So I'm going to read it as Rabbi Eliezer. V'hatznan, Rabbi Eliezer Omer. We're moving into Nida now. Kol isha shavru aleh shalosh onot daya sha'ata. Anyone who learned Nida might remember it derives from the first Mishnah Masechet Nida about a woman who starts menstruating. The question is, she sees blood right now. The question is, was she bleeding previously, and how far back do we have to assume she was for the purposes of tum'ah and tahara, meaning in those days, people were very careful to eat all their food and keep their utensils pure, okay, laws of purity and impurity. And a woman who's in nida, who comes in contact with food or utensils, makes them impure. So because they were so careful about this, they said, since the woman could have started bleeding beforehand and we didn't know, so we go back in time, and there's a whole machloket. The first Mishnah in Masechet Nida is, do we go 24 hours back and say anything she came in touch with in the previous 24 hours, we're going to say are problematic? Or do we say that we're going to go to the last bedika, the last time she checked herself, okay? And we're going to go like that. But the other opinion is to say, no, daya shata, we're going to go by the here and now. She saw blood now. We don't care what happened before. We're going to start right now. So comes Rabbi Eliezer and he says, when it comes to a woman, shavru aleh shalosh onot, 3 months passed and she didn't menstruate at all. Then daya shata, we're going to assume that from here on in, we're going to just say she obviously didn't really bleed before. We're only going to start from when she actually saw blood, because she already proved, this is what we call laws of chazaka, that daya shata, okay, that she doesn't, just one second, I want to check one thing. I think, right, I want to make sure, yeah, okay, so now she's considered what we call in halacha, misuleket amin. We assume she doesn't bleed because she hasn't seen for 90 days, and therefore we're going to be more lenient, and we're going to say, only starts from now. Vitanya, and there's another braita about this that says, now this is Rabbi Eliezer. The rabbis disagree. They say only a woman who falls into the category of a misuleket amim, like someone who's pregnant, someone who's nursing, someone who's menopausal, someone who's a ketana, who's young and barely started getting her period yet. Those women are considered that they barely have blood, but not a woman who is not in one of those categories, even if she didn't see for 3 months. And therefore, he's going to say, no, you have to go back. Okay, so the rabbis are going to say this. So here you have a yachid against rabbin. Okay, the rabbis disagree with him. And there's a braita about this that says, Ma'aseh v'asa Rebbe ke Rabbi Elazar. There was a case where Rebbe paskin like Rabbi Eliezer, la'achar shenizkar, but after he remembered, we're going to have to say, what did he remember? Amal kidayu Rabbi Eliezer l'smach alav b'shat hadchak. He said, well, after he remembered, probably that we don't hold like Rabbi Eliezer, and we'll see what he remembered exactly. He said, well, listen, because this was an urgent situation, we allow it. Now, first of all, what does it mean, shat hadchak? There's a debate here. One opinion says, Rashi says the shat hadchak means it was a year of drought. And because there was a drought, we didn't want to waste food. So if they made the food impure, nobody would eat it. So they wanted to be lenient. That's one option. I think it's Tosfot who says the whole situation is a shat hadchak, because think about it. A woman who, right, let's say, this totally reminds me of now. You get an SMS, okay, that says you have to go into quarantine because you were in a certain place at a certain time, and they've been making lots of mistakes about it. And then you go racking your brain, where was I? Was I really there? Was it true? Wasn't I home that hour? And you try to figure out, and you try to say, you try to remember, and how can you remember, right? Who remembers what they did yesterday, right? Let alone a week ago. So likewise for this woman, if we're going to say everything retroactively that she touched from the last day or from the last bedika is going to be impure, that's going to be very complicated to go figuring out. And let's say, we have to go find people and say, listen, by the way, this kli that you're using, very complicated. So it could be the whole situation is a shat hadchak. Okay, so those are two interpretations. But either which way, he said, because it was a unique situation, we're going to allow this to go like Rabbi Eliezer. So now what does the Gemara say? They want to understand this source. What does it mean after he remembered? Maybe he just forgot who they ruled by. If that's the case, right? He remembered all of a sudden, oh, right, I forgot. We don't hold like Rabbi Eliezer here. We hold like the rabbis. Well, if that's the case, if that's the case, then in a shat hadchak, that shouldn't make a difference. You can't just switch the halacha, right? And if that's the halacha, that's the halacha. It must have been that they hadn't decided. It wasn't like there was a clear-cut decision made. And the achar sheniskar, so what's the achar sheniskar? He remembered Rabbi Eliezer's opinion, but he didn't remember, was it Rabbi Eliezer against a particular rabbi, or was it Rabbi Eliezer against all the rabbis? After he remembered, so first he passed on like Rabbi Eliezer, thinking maybe that it was just Rabbi Eliezer against some other rabbi. When he remembered all of a sudden that the rabbis all disagree with Rabbi Eliezer, and then it became a yachid mul rabim, amal kidayu Rabbi Eliezer l'smach alav b'shat hadchak. Then he said, now we can say, even though he's an individual and he's going against the majority, we're going to be lenient because it's a shat hadchak, because it's a necessary time. But that shows that under normal circumstances, we would not be lenient like a dat yachid against rabim, even in a derabanan issue. This is derabanan because even though we're talking about Tum and Tara, the fact you're only Tamei Oraita if you see blood. Here we're talking about going retroactively. We don't need to go, right? That's already a derabanan where they said, let's make limitations on this. So therefore you see that Yachid Mul Rabim, we would hold like the Rabim, even though they're more stringent, just not to go, just not in this particular situation. Amar Rav Masharshia l'Rava. Rav Masharshia now says to Rava, or Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak l'Rava, he's going to also bring a proof. Okay, both of these are bringing proofs against Rava that there is we do say we go by the majority in derabanans, even if, right, so when you have on your balancing scale, right, you have on the one hand safek derabanan l'kula, we always go more lenient, and on the other hand you have yachid v'rabim, we paskin like rabim, we paskin like the majority is going to win out. Okay, so here he proves either Rav Masharshia or Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak proves of another way. What, you don't think there's a distinction? Of course there is. The Hatanya, and here we're going to go into Dinei Avelut. Okay, there's an interesting Tosfot here, which Gefet is all about, which is interesting because it connects with Avelut, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. Is it different from the Chagim? So if you want to listen to Gefet in Hebrew, it'll be up on the site sometime later today. The Hatanya, Shmu'a Krova Noheget Shiva Ushloshim. If you hear about a person, one of your relatives that died, you didn't hear the day they died, you heard later about it, and they've already been buried, you still sit Shiva and Shloshim. If it's a Shmu'a Krova, we're going to see the difference in a minute, what Shmu'a Krova and what Shmu'a Rechoka. Shmu'a Krova means close, and Shmu'a Rechoka is distant. So if you hear about it distant, and what we mean is in time, okay? You hear about it sooner or you hear about it later, and we'll discuss what the difference is in a minute. If it's rechoka, inanu heget ela yom echad, then you only do 1 day of avelut. If you find out much later that somebody died and they buried them and it was your parent or someone that you're supposed to sit shiva for, you only sit 1 day. Ve'ezo hi krova, ve'ezo hi rechoka, b'toch 30 krova, lachar 30 rechoka. If it's within the first 30 days of the death, it's considered krova. You do shiva and shloshim from the time you hear. If it's rechoka, after 30 days, then you only do yom echad according to Rabbi Akiva. The Chachamim omrim echad shmua krova ve'echad shmua rechoka noheget shiva u'shloshim. Both of them you do shiva and shloshim. The rabbis again are more stringent here. Va'amar Rabba bar Chana amar Rabbi Yochanan. Okay, Rabbi Yochanan said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Kol makom shata motzei yachid mekel v'rabim machmirim halacha k'divrei hamachmirim. Any time where there's an individual who's lenient and the rabbis who are the majority who are more stringent, we go like the rabbis who are more stringent. Kedat hamachmirim hamirubim, like the majority. Chutz mizo, other than this one case. And again, like I said from the beginning, these are going to be exceptions to the rule. She'af al pi sheRabbi Akiva mekel v'chachamim machmirim halacha k'divrei Rabbi Akiva. And why is that? V'sever la k'Shmuel, because he holds like Shmuel, Damar Shmuel, halacha k'divrei hamakel ba'avel. We always go by the more lenient opinion when it comes to avelut. Ba'avelut hu da'kilu be'rabanan, aval ba'alma afilu b'derabanan shani ben yachid b'mkom yachid u'ben yachid b'mkom rabim. So it's clear from here now, only when it comes to avelut, which is an interesting thing, by the way, about avelut, that we always are mekel. It gets to ease the avel and their struggle. But when it comes to other issues, obviously not. So here you see that they go, right? So Rava's question is basically answered by these two sources. Okay. And that supports what we had said earlier, which is that's why you need to say halacha k'divrei hamekel and halacha k'Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, because you would have thought halacha k'divrei hamekel only if they don't disagree with the majority. But if it goes against the majority, maybe we'd be stringent. In this case, we hold like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, even though he disagrees. So again, this is another exception to the rule. That was all in the first explanation, as I told you before, for why we needed both those statements of Rabbi Yochanan about Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri that were said by Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. Now we're going to have two other explanations as to why you need them. For Rav Papa bar Itzrich, you need them both. Why? Salkadat hachamina hanimile be'eruvei chatzerot, aval be'eruvei tchumin emalo tzricha. He says that maybe you would think this is only true that halacha k'divrei hamekel when it comes to eruv chatzerot. When we make eruvim between people living in the same shared courtyard, and we want to be able to carry in the courtyard, maybe there will always go lakula. But eruvei tchumin emalo, and this raises the problem that every time they talk about eruv and they don't specify which eruv, it could lead to misinterpretation. So you might have thought that it was only eruvei chatzerot and not eruvei tchumin. That's why you need to tell you halacha Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, because otherwise you wouldn't have known about this case of the sleeping person. Why would you think that we would make this distinction and be more lenient by eruv chatzerot than we would be about eruv tchumin? And this brings us back to the Mishnah, and I'll explain this case. I had got a question on it yesterday, so I think maybe it's good that we have to go back to it and explain it better. Ditnan, Amar Rabbi Yehuda. Oh, sorry, we're not yet up to the Mishnah. Sorry, we're on a different case. We're going to get back to our Mishnah soon. This is a different case. This is, okay, there's an interesting concept halachically that I'll kind of bring up. It comes up more in the Bavas when we talk about property rights and things like that. So now, okay, before I move on, I just see a question I want to address. Eruv Tchumin is just to clarify all these issues about the difference between Eruv Tchumin and Eruv Chatzerot. Eruv Chatzerot permits carrying. Carrying is when you're not allowed to carry, and it permits you to carry within a space. That is all only for Shabbat because we can carry on Yom Tov. You're allowed to carry wherever you want. However, Eruv Tchumin applies on Yom Tov also. That's why we're having all these cases about the rainwater on Yom Tov, because it's an issue of Eruv Tchumin. It's good to ask these questions because if you're asking them, probably other people also. So never hesitate to ask questions. Okay, so now we have a totally different issue, which comes up in terms of laws, mostly of property laws. If I do something that's good for you, I want to benefit you in some way, I want to accept a gift for you. Can I do that? So what do we say? Yes, because zachin la'adam shelo b'fanav. What does this mean? If it's good for you and only good for you, then of course I can do it for you. I can acquire it on your behalf because I can assume that you would have wanted to acquire it on your own. However, if we say that that it's something that might be bad for you, Okay, I can think of a good example, by the way. You could take a gift that would be bad for you, right? Sometimes people buy you gifts that require upkeep, right? Let's say, I'll give you a radical example. Let's say someone builds a pool in your backyard, okay? It's great to have a pool. On the other hand, a pool requires a lot of upkeep and financial commitment to it. So you might not necessarily say that that's zachin. So here we mean, what if something is both good, but maybe not good for you? Maybe you won't want it, okay? So now we have this issue that it's called ein chavin la'adam shelo b'fanav. You can't do something which is not beneficial, right? Which is the opposite of beneficial. It's maybe going to cause problems to someone, shelo b'fanav, if they don't know about it, without their knowledge, because maybe they're not interested in it. So now let's put that into Eruv Tchumen and Eruv Chatzerot. Eruv Chatzerot basically means we're going to allow me to carry. There's only good to Eruv Chatzerot, right? There's nothing bad about it. It's beneficial to me. But what about Eruv Tchumen? If you do Eruv Tchumen for me and you put down a Tchum somewhere, and then we say, oh, great, now I can walk 2,000 amma outside my city, right, to some other place. I can walk more than the 2,000. I can walk 4,000. I can get to some nearby city. That's great. On the other hand, that means my tchum is there and not in my city, and I can't go the other direction. So that's not necessarily beneficial for me. So therefore, let's read the Mishnah. Ditnan. Amar Rabbi Yehuda. Bamed dvarim amurim that you can't do an eruv for someone else. Be'eruvei tchumin. Aval be'eruvei chatzerot ma'arvin bein ledat u bein shelo ledat. But eruvei chatzerot you could do for someone whether they know about it or whether they don't. Shezachin la'adam shelo b'fanav, exactly as I said. Ve'ein chavin la'adam ela b'fanav. But if you want to do something that's not necessarily beneficial for them, you can only do it if they, b'fanav means in front of their face literally, but what it really means is that they know about it. They don't necessarily need to be there, but they need to know that you're doing this and they need to agree. So what do you see here? Here you see that Eruv Chatzerot, we're more lenient about. We allow you to do an Eruv for someone else, but we don't allow Eruv Tchumen. So there he says, here you see, there's a distinction. And that's why you might have thought, Halacha K'divrei Mekel Eruv maybe was referring to Halacha like this, and not Eruv Tchumen. Second or third answer now, Rav Ashi Amar Itzrich. You really needed to say both. Why? Sakadat Hachamina Hanemile B'Shiurei Eruv, Aval B'Tchilat Eruv Ema Lo. You might have thought they meant only Shiurei Eruv. What's Shiurei Eruv? We put together an Eruv Chatzerot. What does it mean? Each of us needs to give a certain amount, right? A certain amount for a meal for each of us. And then we have all that requisite amount. There's a requisite amount for an Eruvin. It depends how many people are in the courtyard. Let's say we put down the requisite amount and then something happens over time and the food disintegrates, gets eaten, something happens, and we're left with very little. Do we have to put up a new Eruv for future Shabbatot? Okay, so they say we're going to be lenient when it comes, maybe we're more lenient when it comes to Shiurei Eruv, when the Eruv is, kind of messed up down the road, but it's what's left over, but there was already, the Eruv was set up properly, it's just right now it's not so good, versus making an Eruv from the start. So what's our case? We want to know, was he kovea an Eruv at that moment? That's Tchilat Eruv. Maybe the distinction here is when he said, maybe he only meant once the Eruv was set up properly, and now it's not exactly the way it was in the beginning, right? The food's not there anymore. Maybe we can be more lenient there. Maybe that's what he meant when he said, and he wasn't referring to Tchilat Eruv, the setting up an Eruv, which is what Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri was talking about. So let's read it all inside. You might have thought, but maybe you wouldn't think that we could pass on that way to set up an Eruv. To set up an Eruv, everything has to be just right. The exact same structure as the previous one. How do you know that there's a distinction between Shiurei Eruv and Tchilat Eruv? So now we're going to quote another Mishnah. Ditnan Amar Rabbi Yossi. When do you need all these specific shiurim of how many people and how much each one needs to bring? That's when you're setting up the Eruv. But when you have some food left, you've already set it up properly, then as long as there's a little bit of food left, it's sufficient. This is the line we'll get to more when we get to the Mishnah there. But it says that the whole reason for being careful about shiurim and Eruv Chatzerot is so that people don't forget about the Eruv, that you need food for Eruv Tchumen. Why would you think the Eruv Chatzerot will remind you about Eruv Tchumen? Because Eruv Chatzerot is something people did on a weekly basis. Eruv Tchumen you don't do very often unless you're traveling and you want to go somewhere. So because of that, the things that we do much less frequently, people often forget. So they were worried that if they let you, right, that people should be careful about the shiurim for Erev Chatzerot so that people don't forget about Erev Tchumen. But really, once it's up there, you don't really have to be so careful about it. Okay, so in any case, this shows you, both these are examples of you, what might you have thought? Halacha k'divrei hamekel be'eruv maybe only meant either Erev Chatzerot or not Erev Tchumen, or maybe it meant once the Erev was properly set up, then we can be lenient, but to set it up, it has to be set up properly, and then you wouldn't hold like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, and then you'd say he only gets 4 Amo because he really didn't set up his Erev properly, he was sleeping. Okay, and that's why you needed him to tell you, no, we do paskin like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. Now that we got into all these issues about how to Yachid Rabim, okay, and who do we hold like into Rabbanan and Machmir, Meka, all that, they now start discussing some other, and maybe also because we're going to connect this back to our Mishnah, they start discussing some rules about paskining. Okay, different rabbis of the Tanaim, how do we know when we paskin like them and when we don't? So we start off, Rabbi Yaakov, Rabbi Zreka Amru, Halacha ke Rabbi Akiva mechavero, uke Rabbi Yossi mechaverav, uke Rebbe mechavero. They talk about the following 3 rabbis, Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Yossi, and Rebbe, that we always hold like the 3 of them. However, there's a bit of a distinction here. We hold like Rabbi Akiva when he disagrees with a colleague, meaning with one person, not when he disagrees with many people. Likewise with Rebbe, who's Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. But Rabbi Yossi, we paskin ke Rabbi Yossi mechaverav, meaning even if he disagrees with other people, meaning the majority, he can disagree with the rabbis, we're going to hold like him anyway. L'mai hilchata, what's this relevant for, the halacha ke Rabbi Akiva? Does this mean this tells us how we paskin if we have a machloket and we need to determine who do we hold like and we don't know, we paskin like this? So Rabbi Asi amar halacha. Rabbi Asi says, yeah. He says, yes. This determines how we paskin halacha. Rabbi Chia bar Abba amar matin. Says, no. This doesn't mean we paskin halacha. This means we lean toward, we take all sorts of things into consideration. And this is another thing we take into consideration. It's not the only thing. And we lean toward pasking like it, but if there's some other reason not to, we might go against them. Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina amar nirin. Nirin is something much weaker. Nirin means it seems like. This would be something, there's a bunch of examples given this machlokot about how to understand this, but maybe let's say we already paskin like him, and even though we really shouldn't have, well, since we paskin like Rabbi Yossi against the majority, since we have this principle, even though really we weren't supposed to paskin like him in this case, but we let it go. Okay, something like that. It's much weaker. It doesn't mean this is how we determine halacha. Kilashon is in a similar vein. Amar Rabbi Yaakov bar Idi Amar Rabbi Yochanan. He gives in a similar vein in terms of giving us rules, but they're different rules. Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda, he's just talking about different people for the most part. Halacha ke Rabbi Yehuda. If you have Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda in an argument, we hold like Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi, halacha ke Rabbi Yossi. But if Rabbi Yehuda disagrees with Rabbi Yossi is going to win out. This sounds like a mathematical equation. We're going to get in a minute to the transitive property. Ve'ein tzarich lomar, and obviously we don't need to tell you Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yossi, halacha ke Rabbi Yossi, because hashta b'mkom Rabbi Yehuda later, right? If he doesn't stand a chance against Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Yehuda doesn't stand a chance by Rabbi Yossi, then b'mkom Rabbi Yossi mebai. Of course, you wouldn't need to ask about Rabbi Yossi. Amar Rabasi, afani lomed. He adds another one. Rabbi Yossi v'Rabbi Shimon halacha ke Rabbi Yossi. We pass like Rabbi Yossi over Rabbi Shimon. De'amar Rabbi Abba amar Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Yehuda v'Rabbi Shimon halacha ke Rabbi Yehuda. Since he said Rabbi Yehuda v'Rabbi Shimon, we hold like Rabbi Yehuda. Therefore, again, transitive property. Hash b'mkom Rabbi Yehuda later, b'mkom Rabbi Yossi mebayas. So then, obviously, if we pass like Rabbi Yehuda over Shimon, we pass like Rabbi Yossi over Rabbi Shimon. The Gemara is obviously going to ask what? Ibayilu Rabbi Meir v'Rabbi Shimon mai. We mentioned 2 characters, but we didn't, right? Both of these lose out to Rabbi Yehuda and then obviously to Rabbi Yossi. But what about them to each other? So the obvious answer, Teku. We don't know. Amar Rab Misharshia. Rab Misharshia now says something which is going to keep us busy for the next while into tomorrow's daf. Litnihu lahane klali. We don't hold by these things that you just said. Okay, it's not true. So now they want to know, min ale Rab Misharshia hai. Where does he know this from? Maybe he learned it from our Mishnah. And here I said we're going to go back to our Mishnah. Ditnan. Rabbi Shimon Omer, Lema Davar Domer. Remember you had the case where 2 people are eating, right? And then there's this overlap space where there's, one person's allowed in that tchum and one person's allowed in that tchum, but and they're each allowed in the tchum of a third person, but they're not allowed in the tchum of each other. So then he compared it, right? These are 2 different things. That's Erev Tchumin, where the food can't go out of a particular space. So now I can't go into right? I can go, this sounds like in Israel, right? There's area A, B, and C, right? So I am in area A, you're in area C, and there's another person in area B. Now, I can go into area B, my tchum overlaps with his, and area C overlaps with area B, but area A and C don't overlap at all. So we can each eat in area B, but we can't eat, right? We can't go into, I can't go into area C, and area C can't go into, the person there can't go into area A. So Rabbi Shimon said, Lama davar domeh. What is this like? L'shalosh chatzerot haptuchot zo lezo, ptuchot l'reshut harabim. I'll explain this case now a little better than I explained it yesterday. We have 3 courtyards, each open to the public domain. Why is that important? Because what happens, first of all, thank you for correcting me. When I said that, I only meant in part of area B. In other words, in the one space where they overlap, right? It's obvious. You can't eat in all of area B. Just they can sit and eat together in the one space that overlaps. So now we have 3 courtyards that open to each other, and they each open to Reshut Rabim. Why is that important? If one opened into the other, and that one opened into the other, and there was only one exit to Reshut Rabim on the other side, then if they wanted to do any sort of Eruv Chatzerot, certainly the people that are close to Reshut Rabim, since the people on the inner courtyards can pass through them to get to Reshut Rabim, they can't make an Eruv in their Chatzer unless everyone is together. Basically, you need everyone to be together in order to allow this to work. Because if this is what we learned before, if someone doesn't join, they mess it up for everyone else. In this case, each one has their own exit out into Reshut Rabim. So because of that, Rabbi Shimon says, each one is treated individually. So if one does an Eruv with 2, or 2 does an Eruv with 3, 2 and 3 can do an Eruv together, and they can carry within there, and they can go out, and one can go out through their exit, but they're separate. One can't carry into 2 and 3 because they didn't do an Eruv with them, but it doesn't mess up 2 and 3, okay? So let's just read it inside. So 3 chatzerot ptuchot lo zazo, and they're ptuchot to Reshut Rabim. Irvu shtayim achitzoniot ima emtzeid. If each of them did an Eruv with the middle one, he muteret imahem vehem mutaron ima. They can carry back and forth. But shtayim achitzoniot asurot zo im zo. But the 2 outer ones can't carry to each other. Now the rabbis disagree and think that no one can carry unless you do an Eruv with all of them. Now it didn't say that here, but we're going to assume, the Gemara is going to say, we know that it's Rabbi Yehuda who disagrees with Rabbi Shimon. So now we're trying to say, here we're going to have an example where we don't paskin like Rabbi Yehuda over Rabbi Shimon. Okay, and that's going to be our proof that these rules don't apply. V'amar Rav Chamer bar Guria amarav halacha ke Rabbi Shimon. Umam palagale, who's the one who disagrees with him? Rabbi Yehuda. Ha'amar, didn't you say Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Shimon halacha ke Rabbi Yehuda? So therefore, alalav shma mina litnihu. Therefore, I disagree with all your rules. Your rules must be wrong because here I've proven you something that goes against your rule. Remember what we learned? All rules have an exception to the rule, right? Anyway, the Gemara gives a different answer. My kushya, dilma hecha de itmar, itma. Hecha de lo itmar, lo itma. If someone says the halacha is like X, then we paskin like X. The rules are for all cases where we don't have a specific answer. And when we want to know, what do? We don't know. Then we use the rule. And therefore, what Rabbi Sharshia brought doesn't disagree because that's a case where it was said explicitly, we paskin like Rabbi Shimon. But if it's not said, then we're going to hold like Rabbi Yehuda. So therefore, we don't reject what Rabbi Sharshia, that's a rejection of Rabbi Sharshia's claim. Now we're going to bring, like I said, we're going to stop here, but the Gemara is going to continue to bring, we'll see it tomorrow, all sorts of cases where it seems like we go against this rule, and then we're going to have to explain why that's the case, against Rabbi Sharshia, who's bringing these as questions. Okay, have a great day, everyone.